Check one. So now that all of our technical difficulties have been somewhat solved, uh, let's start with the presentation. My name is Zoltán Szabó. I've been an avid LARPer for over a decade now. Uh, I'm really not that special. I'm usually doing all the nerdy stuff that probably you guys are doing, except I have some experience. I have some military background, which probably led me to like camping in harsh conditions. So the title of the speech is Immersive Adventuring, Traveling, Camping, and Bushcraft in Fantasy LARPs. So what are we doing here? Right off the bat, I want to start with a disclaimer. This presentation isn't about that. This is the only true way to do LARP, and if you're not camping immersively, then you are a weakling. No, player safety is above all else. This presentation is to show ideas, gears, and methods on how to camp in a fantasy LARP immersively, if you want to camp immersively. And the goal here is to give ideas, methods, and inspiration to create a personal, compact camping equipment you can carry on foot, which doesn't stand out from the medieval aesthetics. In my humble opinion, that your own immersive and quality gear elevates the game, not just for you, but for the people around you as well. So with that out of the way, please work. Okay, so let's do what most people do when they're about to research medieval aesthetics. Let's see the historical background for the long-distance adventuring lifestyle of foot. So what we usually see in D&D, where adventurers are going on mostly on foot for a long distance and long periods of time. Did people actually live like this? Well, the short answer is, well, yes, but actually no. The long answer is that what's been famous and more prevalent in D&D and fantasy adventuring, what we associate fantasy adventurers with, are actually is a modern concept, that is an amalgamation of certain medieval practices and lifestyles, and modern hiking. We'll see in a bit why is that. But in the meantime, let's check the historical examples from on-the-road lifestyles. The most notable one, most of you are probably familiar with, are pilgrims. People in medieval times, well, medieval was a really broad term, but people in medieval times from all walks of life took on pilgrimages. We are mostly talking about Christians, to certain sites of religious importance. And these were all from lowly peasants to merchants, all the way to nobles. Of course, their method of doing the pilgrimages varied differently from their social status and wealth. Poor peoples traveled on foot, while wealthy merchants and nobles traveled on horseback, maybe on carriages. Other examples were roving mercenary companies. These are usually people from 5 to 20, 30. These mercenaries used to travel on the larger groups, but they also had, in many cases, their own logistics. Roving mercenaries went from campaign to campaign, or even battle to battle, were employed by commanders to participate in the battle. And after the battle was over, they were released from service because they cost money. And the poor man's roving mercenaries were the levies. These are basically peasant people who were mostly fought for food and shelter, basically. They rarely received any payment. Because of this, neither of them are really good examples for what we are looking for, because they traveled in groups, and most of them spent the night in villages on homesteads. For instance, pilgrims were often spent the nights in homesteads and churches, monasteries. So they pretty much done everything to avoid camping in the wilderness. And actually, there was a practice to take in pilgrims or travelers by peasants, for instance, because in exchange for food and shelter, they brought news from the outside world. Obviously, they didn't have the internet and Facebook back in the day, so the only way that news traveled from afar were with people. So it was really an exchange of services, shelter and food for news. And the other example, roving mercenaries, is not a good example for what we are trying to do, because these companies traveled in carriages, and they didn't exactly brought their equipment on their back. They had carts and carriages for that, and we can't exactly really emulate that immersively in a LARP. So, because of that, small personal tents and camping equipment, the way we know them today, just buy a tent that's basically this large. You can just pack it in your backpack and go hiking. They were practically non-existent because of the weight of the used materials, such as tarp, tent tires, tent poles. Tents were generally large, they fit more people, and they were heavy, and they were transported on wagons and carts. So that's not really helping us in achieving what we were looking for. But we'll try it anyway. So, I want to go with a hypothetical situation. Imagine that we are solo adventurers, and our quest takes us from city A to city B. Now, the problem is that the lands between the two cities are quite desolate, and the roads are treacherous. There are no taverns or inns where we can spend the night. There are no homesteads or farms where we can worm our way in for the exchange for some news, and we were given some shelter. So we are forced to spend the night in the wilderness, but that's all right. We came prepared. Let's see what are the requirements to survive in the wild. Essentially, it can be summed up in 3 abilities. The ability to start a fire, the ability to set up a waterproof shelter, and the ability to store food and drinking water. Now, these are quite common sense things. These are, well, duh. But I think it's important to think these through in a structured manner, because if we don't, we tend to overlook even the most simplistic and, well, duh, stuff. I know. Okay. Okay, let's move on. So, I want to introduce 2 golden rules before we start examining how we can explore these abilities. The golden rule number 1, shout out to our dirty hobbies. Minimize impact, leave it as you found it. Which means that whatever we're going to do in a LARP, make sure that you leave the playfield the way you found it. The golden rule number 2, this is more about creating your equipment. Versatility, 1 item, multiple purposes. You'll get that in a minute. So, let's start with the ability to start a fire. Why is it important to have this ability? Fire provides light, warmth, the ability to purify water, and the ability to cook. And it's just a small note, but basically fire jump-started our entire civilization. So, yeah, there's that. How do we achieve this ability? With the simplest medieval fantasy solution, in my opinion at least, is the flint and fire striker. Why? I have a funny anecdote about this. Back when I was in basic training in the Hungarian Defense Forces, we had a survival course, and one of the first things the instructor asked is that, how do you start a fire when you're on the field? everyone's going around, including myself, that, oh, I'm going to use 2 pieces of wood and use friction to produce amber. The other was like, oh, I'm going to untie my shoelaces and make a bow drill out of it, and 2 other wood pieces, and do the same. And when the instructor got bored about this, he simply reached into his pocket and showed us a lighter. It's a lighter, it's a small piece of equipment, it weighs nothing, just bring one with you and you can produce fire instantly. So there's really no need to start building up bow drills and other convoluted ways to produce fire. But do we actually have something like a lighter? We actually do. Let me show you. So, what we have here is a fire striker. So the fire striker is basically a piece of steel, and it is used in conjunction with the flintstone. Let me show you that as well. This is actually a fairly large piece of flintstone. You can just bring yourself a smaller one. But as you can see, this doesn't take up really much space, and it's actually really easy to use. Now, I'm not going to show you because I don't want to set the world on fire. But yeah, you can look up in YouTube how to use it, but it's really something like this. Really, that's pretty much it. So, as you can see, the fire striker, and that was pretty much just my little idea. You don't have to follow it. I made a simple bag to store the flintstone, and another bag which you can store some kindling with you. It will stay dry, so you can start a fire anywhere, even in wet conditions. So, first of all this is moot unless you can actually start a fire in a LARP. So, make sure that you are allowed to start a fire. In many cases, there may be temporary restrictions or the laws don't allow it. So, the whole point is moot if you can't really start it. Also, in most LARP fields, there are designated fireplaces. So, that's the only place you can start a fire. But let's assume that we actually can start a fire anywhere we want. How are we going to do that responsibly without burning down the forest? Make sure to clear the ground first. Usually I advise to clear around a meter wide area and also dig a fire pit. Because when the fire is, because the ground is elevated above, the fire is below the ground, it's going to be much safer. I really don't want to go into how to actually start a fire. There are tons of tutorials, mostly including Bushcraft tutorials on how to start a fire, even with a flintstone and the fire striker. They generally revolves around gather some kindling, you prepare a base and tinder, and you use the tools to start a fire. Do not leave a fire unattended. So if you have to leave your camp, just blow it out. Pour some water on it, make sure that the embers are all extinguished. We don't want any accidents to happen. Golden rule number 1. So let's go to the second ability, the ability to set up a waterproof shelter and bedding. Why is this important? It provides protection from the elements and the degree of insulation. The simplest medieval fantasy solution, which I forgot to bring, is a waterproof cape. Now, a cape can actually be used as a tarp if it's waterproof, maybe handled with wax. That's pretty much a historical way to make it waterproof. There are actually a modern example of using a cape as a tent. The Bundeswehr, the German army, used to issue these ponchos, And these ponchos are deliberately designed in a way that they can actually use it to make a small tent, a one-person tent. And they can be also linked together to ponchos to make a tent. Now, something like along these lines, you can use your cape to make a very small shelter for yourself by maybe gathering some larger pole you can use as a tent pole, for example. But that's really a niche and a pretty inadequate solution. The more sophisticated solution is to bring a waterproof tarp with you. So leather cords and ropes, tent irons, furs and blankets. These all look really nice, but these are a lot of stuff with you. But before we go into how you can actually bring yourself all these things with you, one important note is the bedding should be multi-layered with as many layers between the person and the ground as possible. Now, why is this important? Is because the ground can suck out your core temperature really quickly. That is why it's important that you base your bedding with as many layers as possible. And you can also enhance it with local materials. So gather some leaves as a base, and then you can lay down your bedding under that. Or if there are some pine wood, pine leaves and pine branches are also a very good base for your bedding. So, how the hell are we supposed to carry all these? Well, the simplest medieval fantasy solution is something you probably saw in the last presentation, a linen sack or a basket backpack. Now, these are actually historical examples. The simplest one is the linen sack. There are some historical recordings about the usage of a linen sack. Either it's one way open or both ends are open. The way they use this is that they tie the knots on both ends and they just knot it around themselves. And there are also some historical precedents where they use the sack as a pillow. When they camped, they emptied the sack from their belongings. They gathered some leaves and branches and twigs, stuffed it, and used this as a pillow. Versatility. The others are the basket backpacks, as how we like to call it. I'm sure there are some more precise naming for them, but for simplicity's sake, let's call them basket backpacks. It's really what they are, a basket backpack. It's really not much to explain about them. And this is where we got to my magnum opus. I'm going to show you my over-engineered solution to solve this problem. This is my framed backpack. It was designed the idea that it's a backpack that can be turned into a tent. As you can see, the system is based around, it has three main parts. The first part is the frame itself, which can be disassembled to be used as tent poles. The second main part are the ropes and the tarp. This is a 2 meter by 4 meter tarp, which gives us quite an ample space, even for 2 people. And the third part is the backpack itself, which I can store all my other stuff in it. This is the system, which is completely disassembled. And as you can see, it can be set up in some quite a few different configurations. This was actually my first attempt to build this all up. This was the first configuration that I had in mind. It's really the simplest tent structure. And this was another one, which made some better use of this 2 by 4 meter tarp, because it still has enough space for 2 people to settle in. But also, the waterproof tarp was pulled under me and used as a base for my bedding. So, versatility. We're using one thing for many purposes. So let's go into bushcrafting, because bushcrafting is a very good way to enhance your camp. So it's not just something you brought with you, but you can use the surrounding area to enhance your look of your camp. But first, make sure that you're allowed to actually collect that wood and build, and do not chop down living trees. Now, most bushcrafters, I mean real modern bushcrafters, tend to use this as a sort of mantra. So the important thing is that you minimize the impact for the environment you are in. So mostly use the dead wood you found lying on the ground. It may limit your options, but still. Enhance the shelter with bushcrafting techniques, but in order to do that, you will require some gear. And I think these are the minimum tools to do that. Utility knives and a hand axe. I'm going to show you these. So this is one example of a medieval aesthetic utility knife. This is another one. This is a much smaller one. As you can see, there's not much to look at. It's a blade with a shaft, and that's it. These are the bare minimum. You're going to need a blade to shape the surroundings around you. This is some more advanced stuff. So the axe is actually the best tool to show what I mean in versatility, because an axe usually doubles as a hammer as well. So you don't need to bring a hammer with you. So how to enhance your camp with the equipment I just showed you. This is a bushcraft camp we did in a LARP a couple of years ago. We had express permission from the owner of the land to do this. This is all made from dead wood, so wood lying around in the forest. And this is one of the basic examples of how to do bushcrafting. So what we did is we set up basically a simple H frame. There were there were three main poles. We connected it with another pole, and we used basically a triangle shape. And then we used some tarp to fix it, and that gave us a pretty wide shelter. We can actually stand up in it. But as you can see, it's fairly open as well, so actually we're kind of lucky that there were no heavy raining, or it wasn't really windy. And the other way to enhance your camp is to build heat-reflecting or windbreaker walls around the campfire. It also looks good and kind of gives a sense of protection. So this camp was actually surrounded with these heat-reflecting walls. And it's a really simple and basic structure. What you do is to set up two smaller poles close to each other, pairs, and you basically stuff poles horizontally above each other, and you just tie some knots in the top of it. And that's it, yeah. The thing it does is that it also kind of limits the play field, because no one really wanted to stumble upon that windbreaker wall. And actually, there is realistically really no more time for camp building for a 2 to 4 day LARP. So this is really the maximum you can do, because this took us the better half of an afternoon and then the next morning as well to completely finish it. And there were the 3 of us. So let's say you're doing a camp for yourself. You won't really do much aside from setting up a shelter for one person, and then maybe build a windbreaker or heat reflector wall next to your campfire. So this is going to be the most straightforward one. The ability to store food and drinking water doesn't really need an explanation on why you need food and drinking water. So how do we do that? Well, hunting is historical. It's obviously out of the question because aside it's probably illegal everywhere. You need specialized tool and the actual ability to hunt for small game or large game. Source foraging, while it would be feasible, it's also mostly illegal, and even if it's not illegal, you really need to know what you are doing. You really need to recognize what you are foraging, including mushrooms, fruits, vegetables, whatever you can find around the playfield, but really just don't do it. So, that really leaves us with one option. The simplest medieval fantasy solution is rations, meaning food you brought with yourself, obviously. For imitating a 2 to 3 day trips, you have quite a few options. You can bring yourself some bread because it won't really go stale for a 2 to 3 day trip. You can bring yourself fruits, vegetables, and dried meats like bacon, sausages, salted porks, etc. Well, what I mostly do is store the food in a separate bag, wrapped in clean clothing. That's really the only immersive way you can do that. Avoid products that spoil and go sour without refrigeration, or cook them early on. How can you cook them early on? Well, you need the ability to create fire, and you also need something to cook with it. Now, this is my copper frying pan. It was really a steal. I just bought it on a flea market. People go to flea markets. It's a treasure trove. I opted to go with the copper pan because it's fairly light, and that way I can reduce the weight I have to carry with myself. Storing water. Well, we have quite a few options there, like water skins, gourds, and flasks. But I'm going to show the budget version. This is basically a modern aluminum canteen, which I use some leftover leather to make a cover like this. You can also do that with any PET flask, for instance. Anything that doesn't look modern is already immersive, I think, at least. Here is the example, and keep water on you because hydration is extremely important. As my colleague said, we often forget to hydrate even in our day-to-day lives, let alone in a LARP. So that's why you should really keep one yourself, because you will feel the weight of it. This is a half a liter canteen. You will feel the weight of it, and you might not forget it that often. So, let's recap what we've done so far. We built a fire pit. We have some fire going. Gathered enough firewood. So that's settled. We set up a tent or a shelter, either with the equipment we brought with ourselves, or we enhanced it with some bushcraft techniques. Maybe we built a heat-reflecting wall. We ate some rations. We refilled our water containers. We are well hydrated. So we want to go to sleep in our cozy bedding, which is multi-layered, so we won't get sucked out the heat out of us. And then bandits ambush the camp and kill in our sleep because no one stood watch. Wait, what? Okay. Well, I guess all our efforts were in vain, so that's it. Thank you for listening and safe travels. I think we actually have some time to, yeah, actually quite good. So we have 10 more minutes that if you want to examine the equipment yourself, please go for it.